So let's do a little bit of a review. We're at the end of a section where in this section we were basically configuring your work environment, getting you started with a work environment that works well. And so the review, flying all over the place with that text, the review for this section is like you learned some awesome stuff. And I like taking a moment just to reflect upon what we're accomplishing and what we've learned because it actually reinforces the learning, right? The more you roll around in something, the more it sticks. Learned that from my dog. and and so now we're reviewing, right? So we're rolling around in this material. It's good to do this preview, view, review. That helps us learn. Anyhow, sometimes can't help but to show like what actually helps people learn well. This is like, if you study education. All right, so the review, this is going to help you learn well. And we've learned some awesome stuff. And it's also just like congratulatory or whatever. It's like, hey, I'm doing great. It's a milestone. I reached the end of a section. I learned some great stuff. On to the next one. Okay, so we've learned about editors. That's a big thing. To figure out which editor you're going to use and to know some of the basic nuances of them and how to get them set up, that's huge. And so you've learned about 3 really great editors. And you've learned about some of the most popular editors, like Sublime's probably the most popular, Atom's the biggest up and comer, and then WebStorm is great if you want a more like GUI intensive environment and also something that sort of lends itself well to other programming languages like Java or Android Studio, right? So yeah, learned about editors and we saw that live preview thing, which was great. And you saw, like in WebStorm, how to access the keyboard shortcuts in the key map reference. And you saw how to set it up and to get your themes all in a certain way. Whoa, that's huge. And to download the best font ever for WebStorm. And to even just bring it in to look just like mine. And we learned about plugins and packages. So a lot of great stuff about editors. And then we learned about the terminal. And we did some terminology disambiguation, where we talked about, hey, terminal, bash, command prompt, shell, what are all these different things? And so, we learned that pretty much terminal is Mac Unix and command prompt is Windows, and bash and shell are also kind of, Mac Unix. But just think terminal, Mac Unix, command prompt, Windows. And yeah, so we learned about those 2 things, and you learned about the history of how people interfaced with computers. It used to just be on the command line, and we call that command line interface CLI. And today, it's all, a lot of the way most people use the computer is graphical user interface or the GUI. And you saw some of the history behind the evolution of that in software. So that's pretty awesome. And then you learn basic commands for working at the terminal. So that's another really big piece. And then the next thing we learned about was Git and GitHub, and you learned about the history of Git and how it evolved and this interesting, story from computers, and then we learned how GitHub was created, and you saw how to create a repo, and you also got some basic commands for, what's the basic workflow for working with Git and GitHub. And so all of that is a really big chunk of knowledge. It's a really useful piece of knowledge. It's like a really solid foundation for the next stuff we're going to build, which is like starting to actually write some code. So I know there's been a lot of setup, and we haven't just jumped right into like, let's start writing HTML, because I want you to know what you're doing, and I don't want you to end up in an environment and to be a fool. I want you to have as much knowledge and resource and information as possible, and to know these little anecdotes from, hey, where did GitHub and Git come from? And where did, the graphical user interface, how did that evolve? And what's the story behind that with Xerox Palo Alto Research Center? Because those things are good to know. They're great to know. And knowing how to use Git and GitHub and terminal and those commands, that's all stuff that's essential to working well as a web programmer today. So you're doing great, and I'm just looking for my review. Where did it go? Right there. You're doing great, and we've learned some awesome stuff. And take a moment just to congratulate yourself and pat yourself on the back. You're making good headway, and go celebrate. You have my permission. Go out to dinner with a friend. Yay! I learned some awesome stuff. Or go have a beer, at least get up and get a drink of water and a piece of fruit or something. All right, because we're going to jump into actually start creating web pages and learning HTML and CSS in the next videos. That's what's coming up next.